Hello guys! Today I will walk you through my experience at Noma. Noma is a 3 Michelin star restaurant located in Copenhagen. After winning the world's best restaurant title by 50's Best too many times, it became ineligible to compete further. However, many people still consider it the world's finest. Now I will take you through my experience at this restaurant during their Ocean season 2024, and I'll share everything from start to finish. I will also make a separate video about the booking process because, as you might have heard, booking a table at Noma can be quite challenging. However, it's not impossible. We took a cab from the city center, which took us about 10 to 15 minutes. At first, I was a bit surprised about the choice of the location of the restaurant because it's not in the nicest area and it's a bit secluded. But once we arrived, I completely understood the choice. It's surrounded by nature and there's big enough space for them to grow their own herbs and plants, but it's still close to the city center. Once we arrived at the entrance, we were directed to the greenhouse, where many people were already waiting. We waited there for a few minutes until it was our turn to go to the restaurant and be seated. We walked to the restaurant building, and the first thing we saw was a door covered with shells. So the Ocean season was definitely noticeable from the very start. We were greeted at the door and led to our table. The first thing that happened was that we were greeted by a friendly team of servers who were waving at us and saying hello. Inside the restaurant there was a pond with shells, a very large open kitchen where a lot of people were preparing food. The interior had a clean, modern Scandinavian style, with wooden tables, no tablecloths, not exactly what I expected. It was elegant, but relaxed at the same time. I really liked how big the windows were, and they provided views of the Danish nature with water and greenery. Regarding the dress code, people were dressed very differently. Some in suits, others in hoodies. A very interesting mix of people from all over the world. What I didn't like was how loud it was inside. There was a lot of people and people were talking very loud, and there was no music. Our lunch reservation was at 12:30. I was really surprised about how big the place was and how packed it already was when we got there. When I compare it to other Michelin star restaurants, it was much bigger. The reason why we booked such an early table was because it was the only option available. However, it's worth noting that the food is identical for lunch and dinner. We obviously went for the wine pairing option. The price of the lunch menu was 3,990 Danish kroner and the wine pairing came at 2,100. As we sat down, we were introduced to some of the ingredients of the upcoming dishes. These ingredients included sea urchin, Norwegian langoustine, scallops, and other small shellfish. The first dish arrived. It was langoustine cooked to perfection. It came with a flavorful mussel sauce, served inside of a shell, and a bowl with seaweed on top. Underneath the head of the langoustine, there was an intense umami vegetable fudge, and the edge of the plate was covered in plankton and pine powder, which added a citrusy flavor to the dish. Under the nest of seaweed, there was a hidden soup, which was meant to be sipped through the seaweed. The soup had intense flavors. It was like a seafood soup with a hint of miso. Maybe the best dish in the entire tasting, because it had familiar and safe yet sophisticated flavors. The second dish was a trio of seaweeds served on a fermented shrimp sauce. The textures ranged from creamy to crunchy, and the whole thing just screamed ocean, but in a very fresh way. The following dish arrived without utensils. It was a mussel with a stone on top, and it opened up when the stone was lifted. The mussel was wrapped in yellow beet, which added crisp and sweetness. Next dish was a soup served in a heavy jar with a lid. The soup was made of raw sea urchin with almond flakes. The flavors were incredible, very intense flavors of the sea. The sea urchin was so soft that it melted in your mouth, and the almond flakes added to the great texture. Next came my favorite dish of the evening, slices of raw Danish squid over a grilled barley cake. The slices were so thin that the squid had a texture of rice paper. It was combined very well with spices that offered a hint of Asian flavors. It actually reminded me of some of my favorite dim sum items. The barley cake added a smoky taste with a touch of sweetness. It was just perfect. The following dish was cod roe on a miso crisp and Icelandic wasabi underneath. Surprisingly, it almost had a meaty ham-like flavor. The texture was like a high-quality crisp with a thick slice of ham. Yet the taste was more intense and had a very unique sea flavor. The next dish was a scallop, half raw and half seared, served in its shell. The sauce was based on Japanese tea and had a slightly milky light flavor. Around the edges there was wasabi powder that gave the dish some heat. The overall combination was excellent. I really liked the texture of the scallop. It was a bit firmer on the seared side, yet perfect. There was also fresh roe under the scallop, which gave a creamy flavor that reminded me of sea urchin. The next dish was probably the most interesting one. It consisted of two components. a cod tongue served on the bone inside of a dried cod head. You had to pull out the bone to eat it. Then there was a side dish which contained the cod's eye. The tongue was very soft, a bit doughy. Again, it reminded me of dim sum or Chinese dumplings, and the spices had a touch of Sichuan-like flavors. I've had cod tongue many times in Norway as it's a very popular dish, but never served in a way like this or on the bone. Then to the side dish. The cod eye was served on trout roe and a seaweed tart. The idea of eating the eye felt a bit unusual and a bit disturbing. It had a mild flavor and a jelly-like taste. At least they used the whole fish. The next dish had two different components again, cod throat and cod cheek. The cod throat came with a sauce of parsley, fig leaf oil, and green garlic. It was tender, a little bit like cod, but then very soft and juicy. The cod cheek was served on the bone, and it was topped with a green pumpkin and tomato rub. This one also had a dim sum feel, even though the flavors and the ingredients of the rub were different. At this point, we got an unfiltered red wine, a nice switch from the whites. The next dish was a kombucha scooby with crispy sea cucumber. We had divided opinions at the table about this dish, but to me it was one of my favorites. The sauce was a bit intense and highly fermented, but I loved it. It had a deep umami flavor, maybe a bit too fermented for people not used to Asian flavors. The next dish featured burbot, not to be confused with turbot. It was a white fish served on a stick that was shaped like a shell. It was maybe one of the more classic dishes, but it was presented in an incredible way. It was cooked to perfection. The consistency was meaty, almost like lobster, with a marinade that tasted a little bit like barbecue sauce. And it also came with the egg yolk dipping sauce. The next dish was the first dessert. It was a combination of bergamot with seaweed oil topped with caviar. It was a perfect dish for me because I'm not a dessert fan and because I love caviar. The addition of the caviar brought a savory touch and a silky texture. Next was another dessert. It looked like a real oyster, but it was actually ice cream. When you opened it, there was marmalade and other little bits inside. The final dessert and the last dish of the tasting menu was stick bread and a shell filled with a thick cloudberry gel. Cloudberries grow in the north of Norway where I currently live, so these flavors were familiar to me. The dish was not too sweet and therefore again a perfect choice for my taste. It was a bit like eating a dessert made with French pastry filled with marmalade. And even though it might be considered a typical French dessert, it somehow reminded me of some Polish desserts from my roots. All the dishes were very well portioned and offered a variety of intense flavors without leaving me too full. The dessert provided a perfect, satisfying conclusion to the meal. After the meal, we ordered a glass of champagne and we were offered a tour by our main waitress, who also was one of the managers. She took us through the different parts of the restaurant, including a large kitchen in the back, the staff dining area, and their food labs where they test out new ideas. Getting a look behind the scenes really added something special to the experience. Regarding the service, I was pleasantly surprised about the number of people actively involved in the food preparation. All the servers were very attentive and provided excellent service. Our wine glasses were never empty. There was a huge attention to small details. For example, when you left your seat, the staff would take your cloth, hang it on your chair, and pull out the chair for you upon return. One thing I was curious about was whether the staff would notice that my partner is left-handed. And they did. They placed the utensils on the other side for him. I've been to many great restaurants, but this is something that actually have only happened once, and that was at Sabio Makasi in Stavanger. Overall, Noma was an incredible experience from start to finish. The dishes didn't just taste like the sea, they also looked like the sea, with beautiful plating using stones, seaweed and shells. Everything felt thoughtful, artistic, and full of flavor. They use ingredients you rarely see, like the cutthroat, tongue, even the eye, and they somehow made them delicious. It really felt like a tribute to the whole fish in nature. The umami and fermented flavors were strong, so it's definitely for adventurous people who are open to try something new a little bit outside of the norm. If you're more traditional to your tastes, it might be a challenge, but still an amazing experience. I really found it an amazing experience and I'd love to return to try a different season someday. That's it for today. Thank you for joining me and stay tuned for more episodes. There are many more to come.